Hello everybody, CVH here. It's getting close to the end of the month, and earlier today, the monthly reward card for the ladder for the month of February was revealed, and it's none other than what's on screen right now, Heroic Rebirth. So obviously, we're going to be doing a video on it. I'll be talking about my opinions on the card. I'll be going in depth with that after I talk about a little bit of the basics, where I think this card might fit in deck-wise, if it might impact the meta whatsoever, because a lot of these previous monthly reward cards have sort of fallen flat after a little bit of experimentation. I'll be talking about whether I think that'll happen, and of course the big polarizing discussion surrounding the card and the level of RNG or randomness that it sort of injects into the games that it's played. So first of all, the basics: 3 cost neutral support, activate, uses of 3, of course, 3 uses like a lot of these different supports, and the activate ability is transform a creature card in your hand into a random legend. So this was kind of vague at the start, but what we figured out is you choose the creature in your hand, and it turns into another card in your hand, which is a unique legendary creature card. So examples of this being something like Tazcat, Odaving, you get the idea with the little gem. You can only use one of those in your deck, the unique creature legendary cards. So basically, at first glance, it seems like a value control card. You're basically spending a little bit of tempo, magicka, and time early, much like a Mundus Stone, Wabbajack, Orb of Vermina. There's a comparison can be made across a lot of cards, but your benefit in this case isn't really card advantage, since you are expending the Heroic Rebirth and not really gaining numbers of cards. It's not like Orb of Vermina where you're drawing 3 cards for the price of 1, even though they are copies of your opponent's cards. Heroic Rebirth, you are simply transforming cards that already exist in your hand, or cards, if you're playing this from an open hand for some situation, you are top decking cards and potentially you don't like the Windkeep Spellsword you drew, so you get to activate the Heroic Rebirth, transform it into a unique legendary, randomly obviously. So basically, without further ado, it's really hard to judge these RNG cards. I'm going to try a little bit, but obviously there's 2 basic ways this can go. A lot of people overvalue these RNG cards at the very start because they only sort of see the really high roll, right? They see the best possible case scenario, and often with an RNG-based card, that best possible case scenario is insane, and they judge the card without really thinking about the low roll end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is to misjudge the RNG card and undervalue it because you're so worried about the scope of the RNG that you don't really think about how good it is on average. And this is sort of something that happened basically in a big picture with Yogg-Saron in Hearthstone. Those of you who are familiar with that card, does a lot of random stuff, check it out. But I and many other competitive players in Hearthstone basically looked at the card and immediately wrote it off too random, too inconsistent to ever see competitive play. Not only was that card in fact playable, but it was meta-defining, deck-defining, and, match-defining up to BlizzCon. All kinds of tournaments were decided based on Yogg, and it was basically just a clown fiesta, possibly the worst designed card I've ever seen in my entire life. So now that's sort of that fear, right? A lot of people do gravitate towards Elder Scrolls Legends because while the game itself is very similar to Hearthstone functionally and the way things actually operate, the card design seems to be much better, and more importantly for a lot of people, it seems to be much farther away from that RNG-based card design. That being said, there are a lot of cards in Legends that do involve a lot of RNG, such as Mundus Stone and Wabbajack, and I'll draw comparisons to those as we move further into the video. Like right now, let's do it. A lot of the basics have been covered already by many people. Check out other people's videos as well to get multiple opinions. I definitely encourage that. But it's the good RNG versus bad RNG debate. There's definitely room for RNG in a game. I've gone on record by saying the RNG levels of the game currently are pretty adequate for my tastes. We have Wabbajack, which is incredibly random, and Mundus Stone, which people are complaining about a lot recently, so I'm going to bring it up even though it's not quite as random as Wabbajack. It only has the 7 possible outcomes, as in the 7 possible keywords you can roll. But yeah, it is one of the more played RNG based cards. So there are 2 things to really consider in my opinion when thinking about whether a card is good RNG or bad RNG. The first is does it impact the board immediately, and the second is the scope of the RNG. So impacting the board immediately, this card definitely does not. Mundus Stone definitely does not. Obviously if you play it with more magicka than 4, you can play a creature afterwards, then it will somewhat impact the board. But even then, the impact is somewhat low because you're only rolling a keyword, and out of the 7 possible keywords, at any given situation, it's likely that a few are dead, a few are very average, and only 1 or 2 at any given time is actually insane, as in the best possible case scenario. Like your guard got ward, or your giant finisher got charge, or you rolled drain when you're trying to stabilize, that kind of stuff. So, yeah, Yogg-Saron and Wabbajack do impact the board immediately. Yogg-Saron is a creature, but a lot of the time what's going to happen is it's going to blow up the entire board. The scope of RNG is humongous. It's impossible to play around. That was one of the main problems with it. The scope was huge. The impact of the board was immediate. Wabbajack does impact the board, but only one single creature on the board. The scope of Wabbajack is also huge. It's also not a creature itself, so that's one downside of the card. Wabbajack also involves decision-making. Yogg-Saron involved none. That's one benefit to Wabbajack, if we're going to talk about that a little bit. The skill involved in that card is deciding what to target, and that is balanced because there is skill involved in choosing when to hold back your charges, whether to target your opponent's large thing that you want to make potentially smaller and less threatening, whether to target your own thing that you want potentially bigger and more threatening, or whether to just simply hold it and keep the charges for a later turn. And it is balanced, in fact, by the huge scope of RNG, because not only it is unpredictable, which can lead to some upsetting losses, of course, but the scope of RNG means there's so many possible low rolls because there are so many bad creatures in the game that you could be choosing into. It's very rare that there's a time when you're Wabbajacking your opponent's threat, and it's not possible that something even more threatening can come out, even if it's like the exact same thing. It could potentially happen, right? So even then, you could possibly Wabbajack your own 3/3, thinking that of course it'll get bigger, and then it turns into an enraged mudcrab or something similarly terrible. So in Wabbajack's case, it is actually balanced by the huge scope of RNG, even though potentially you get something absolutely insane. The odds of those things are extremely low in comparison. So yeah, in the scope of RNG for Heroic Rebirth, one of the main problems I have with the card is that the scope is large enough, in my opinion, for it to be hard to play around, and small enough for it to be good more consistently than Wabbajack. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Basically, for unique legendary creatures, I'm not going to bore you with the actual numbers. I think the end result is something around 20 possible outcomes at the moment. Adoring Fan, obviously the worst one, as far as unique legendary creatures go. And the three that are also pretty bad are Reeve, Blade Master, Ungolem the Listener, and Lucian Lachance. So potentially we have like 4 possible bad outcomes. And we're going to be thinking about this, of course, in the control versus control mirror, because this card is pretty slow, and you're going to be playing it in matchups where you likely have time to be playing those creatures in the late game in the first place, and where the tempo loss is basically reasonable to have. So if we're playing in a control versus control mirror, not only do you only have 4 low rolls, but you have a lot of insane high rolls. You have General Tullius, you have Iron, you have Red Brahmin is absolutely nuts, Marak is absolutely nuts, Tazcat is absolutely nuts, the list goes on. And the thing is, even if something is not particularly nuts, like Helena Banach is not nuts, but it's one of those cards that has a very unique and specific effect. These cards are sort of entrenched in their own lore from the Elder Scrolls. It can pull anything from any color, so it pulls anything from like a Ram Scout deck, for a Control Spellsword deck, from an aggro deck. All of a sudden, all these legends become something you have to play around. So the problem is that there are so many potential different effects that just popped into your hand with even one use of the Heroic Rebirth, that as soon as it's used, it basically becomes almost impossible to play around every possible contingency. And that's pretty annoying when you're trying to play a skill-based game. At least with a card like Wabbajack, you know immediately what the new situation is, because the card goes directly to the board. With a card like this, you could play it on turn 2 with the ring, or turn 3, basically raw from your hand, transform something you didn't want to play in a control mirror, like a Bruma Profiteer, something very low impact, in your hand, and change it into something potentially insane, and it's very hard for your opponent moving forward to make reads on what you possibly pulled, unless you just happen to play it, and they have to sometimes even hope it's Adoring Fan. Like, do you hold off on your threat because they might have gotten Marak? Does it look like they have Marak? Do you hold off on dumping 2 things in the lane because they might have gotten Red Brahmin? Do you expend additional resources to make an unfavorable clear on this one extra creature they have in their lane in case they got Merrick? Like, all of that becomes pretty obscenely hard to do. And at the end of the day, you're sort of just rolling a die yourself. Your opponent sort of rolled the die on Heroic Rebirth, and then you have to sort of roll the die on what you think it's reasonable to play on in that case. And I foresee a lot of situations, if this card sees play, on it being pretty upsetting in those cases. So yeah, the impact of the board isn't really there, which is good, and it's definitely for slower decks, and this is really what balances the card, because I think the value and the difficulty of it being played around is incredibly high, and that's definitely not something I like to see personally. My initial question when I saw the card, and this might be upsetting or offending or whatever, I don't mean to offend anyone, obviously I have much love for the Dial Digital team. I think the card design in this game has been pretty exquisite and spot on until now, but the main question and word that came into my mouth originally when I saw the card was just why. Like, I didn't really understand it. So basically what I mean by that is for a monthly reward card, it doesn't really fit what I'd expect. I'm not really sure what the point was in developing it. Obviously it's getting people talking, and I think that's great. There's been a lot of opinions and debate on Reddit, and I think that's good. It mobilizes the community and gets people discussing things. That's definitely good, so it has that positive checked out. But when I think of a monthly reward card, I think of a few things, and this doesn't really fit the bill. Well, I mean, first of all, I expect the card to be epic. This one is an epic, so it, checked that mark. But I do expect it to sort of encourage experimentation or like more playing with a specific type of deck. For example, Mechanical Ally definitely encouraged Dwemmers. People, as soon as that card was released, even though the rest of the deck wasn't so good, Mechanical Ally seemed good enough, and people started playing that, and it really impacted, people were excited to play Dwemmers. I remember streaming, and people were like, hey, did you play Dwemmers? And I was like, I just played it yesterday, but, if you really want. So, it got people excited about a different style of deck. Battle Reeve of Dusk, similarly, it released at a time when Action Assassin was really good. A lot of these keyword decks were gaining momentum, and even though Battle Reeve itself has a really low power level and wound up falling off, it did encourage people to play those decks even more, experiment with Battle Reeve of Dusk and sort of new things. And a lot of cards are like that. We saw that a lot with the Madhouse collection as well. Illusory Mimic experimented with keyword decks. Swindler's Market even had synergy with one of the monthly reward cards, which is Smuggler's Hall. When something like a small release happens, I expect it to sort of encourage certain strategies to emerge or at least be experimented with. It should encourage people to sort of come out of their comfort zones. And even Stampede Sentinel, it was sort of just a beat stick and pretty easy to analyze, but it had a purpose, and I saw it and I was like, all right, well, this is another beat stick for red for Arena. It definitely has some cool implications against certain decks like the Swindler's Market deck, and it could fit a pretty neat part in the curve for Midrange Warrior, which is the deck I played in on this channel. Midrange Archer, it seemed like a card which I could see why they designed it. And the only potential reason that I could see for designing this card is that it's definitely fun for new players to be able to do something wacky and beat opponents that they might not have won the game otherwise with, and potentially play with legendary cards they don't actually own. And as I saw, Santos Vela was talking about this in his stream earlier, and he was kind enough to repeat it in English for me. He streams mostly in French, but he was talking about it, and he was like, it seems kind of strange that a card that was primarily designed for new players doing wacky things was given to us in a month before the official release of the game. This is probably 1 or maybe 2 months before the official release, so if this card does wind up being playable and something new players want to experiment with, they're probably going to have to craft it the hard way, which is a little awkward if that is the goal for the card. The other potential goal that many people are concerned about is that they're trying to attract the Hearthstone player base by sort of imitating the RNG elements of the game. Like I mentioned, we do already have a fair bit of RNG in the game itself, which is similar to Hearthstone at its core. We have Wabbajack and Mundustone, but I think those cards are balanced. I've made cases for them. I'll continue to do so in the future. But the problem is when we reach a critical mass of RNG. If we have those cards impacting the game, we have cards like Royal Sage and Blood Magic Lore, which I also think are basically balanced in the game, and then we keep adding more, it does sort of become like Hearthstone, because even Hearthstone at a time had only a few RNG cards. It was possible to know what they are, play around them. The scope of them wasn't incredibly wide. There were no unstable portals or Yogg-Saron's, and when you start adding cards with a wider scope, and there's so many of them, they start like overlapping, and then you have these crazy situations, and the games sort of just happen. You wind up playing a game, your opponent's playing a game, and you're both technically taking part, but the cards themselves are the ones deciding the outcome, and it becomes a little less skillful. And as I mentioned, with the Wabbajack, at least you have the skill involved in knowing when to play it and what to play it on. Heroic Rebirth, it seems like it's sort of autopilot almost. If you're playing it in a control versus control mirror, it's just sort of a plop it down and choose the worst card in your hand, and it's likely going to be better. So my main problem with it is that the scope of RNG, it's easy to play. In one of those control versus control mirrors, the scope is wide enough for it to be incredibly difficult to play around, and the scope is low enough for you to basically know that you're going to get something value. And even if you do roll that Adoring Fan, this is not basically a situation like my Balmora Spymaster happened to roll low. That sucks for me. Wish it didn't give me Nord Firebrand. This is a situation where, well, as long as I have additional time, I can just roll again. I have 3 uses. I could turn that Adoring Fan into Marak, or Red Brahmin, or Tazcat, or General Tullius, or just something that takes over the board, something that does something insane effect. A lot of crazy things can happen. So that's really my question, is I really am not sure what positive, and I was sort of ranting on my stream earlier. I had a bit of time to cool down. I actually recorded this video twice to sort of hammer out my thoughts a little bit more intelligently, but I'm probably still rambling a bit. I apologize for that. It's kind of late here, but now I'm actually rambling. That's the problem. But yeah, I was talking about it, and I was like, I don't really understand what positive implication this could have for the game. I don't really see well, first of all, like I said, it's very hard to analyze these cards. I'm not totally sure if it is playable. I'm willing to bet it is mostly subpar, just because, these cards that have the insane effects wind up being too slow in many, many matchups. Like, a lot of the top-tier decks currently, I don't see this being good in, but if we do wind up in a slower meta where this card is good, I don't see it being good for the game, So, like, even though it might not be good in this particular meta, it sort of limits the design space because now, God forbid we get in a meta where this card is good, because then all of a sudden games start getting decided on it. Right now games get decided on who top decks Blood Magic Lord into Control Mirror, but the scope of that card is just, 4 different cards. You can play around those, you kind of know what's going to happen. Rarely is it insane, there are always relatively bad options, but if you're transforming cards that are useless in your hand with Heroic Rebirth into one of these unique legendaries, I don't see it being too much of a negative implication. Very risky in the current fast meta, but if the meta did slow down, this could just be a problem. And even if, there are basically only 2 options here, which is kind of what we're going to finish with this. There's only 2 options with a monthly reward card, or any card that gets released. Either it's strictly unplayable, in which case, as a monthly reward card that you're supposed to encourage people to grind for, I don't get it if it's strictly unplayable. Or 2, it's at least marginally playable. Now, I'm pretty sure we can write off this card being insane and played and everything because it's clearly limited by, it should be in a slow deck more than likely. And basically it should be in, it has peak effectiveness against other slow decks when you have the time to play it. So we can sort of write that off. But yeah, if it's at least marginally playable, I still don't really get it, because I'm not really sure what they're aiming for with this. I don't really know. It doesn't really encourage experimentation with a specific style of control deck. It doesn't really encourage unique deck building in any way, because the cards are literally coming out of thin air, and it doesn't seem to encourage any specific strategizing when you're actually playing the card. It seems like the most difficult decision with this card will be whether or not it's appropriate in the correct meta to include it in your deck in the first place. After that, it seems like the card that sort of kind of plays itself. You're just sort of switching the worst card in your deck, or worst card in your hand, or the worst top deck. If you top deck one of those 2 drops late in the game, you can just switch it out. And yeah, it's pretty hard to answer. Obviously, the first charge of it will go off without a hitch if you're playing it and charging it immediately with the use. Otherwise, you'll probably get more uses unless they expend a Shadowfen Priest, which could have silenced something else on this, or, like a Heaven background here. Support removal. Dedicated support removal like Edict of Azure, that would be a 1-for-1. You'd be pretty happy if your Heroic Rebirth transformed your 2-drop into a 9-drop, and then they had to waste an Edict of Azure and their own tempo on your negative tempo play. That would set you up in a great spot. So yeah, I'm not really totally sure. It might sound like I'm ranting, but I don't know. Basically, at the end of the day, I don't think this card is insane. I think overall, if we really look at the playability of it, it's probably less than Smuggler's Hall, it's probably less than Stampede Sentinel. That's not why I'm upset. I don't think they released this insane RNG card. I think it's less playable than Mundustone, and I think it's good that it's less playable than Mundustone. But I still don't totally understand. I'm not totally on board with the card being created. I hope in the future that they'll sort of err on the safe side of caution. Let's say this card really doesn't impact anything and we don't have anything to worry about there. That's likely scenario, but I hope they do err on the safe side of caution and just sort of avoid generating cards that have their entire basis in RNG. A little bit of RNG is fine, and some cards that are fully RNG are fine, like Mundustone and Wabbajack, if they're appropriately balanced and they're limited. And that's the main issue here, is that I don't really think this encourages what I'd expect it to encourage for a monthly reward card, and I think if it does see any amount of play, it could be one of those very upsetting cards, because it's very, very difficult to play around. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Heroic Rebirth, very polarizing card with a lot of interesting, I wouldn't say interactions, but could generate some very interesting game states. I think this is a card that if Disguised Toast are playing this game and making videos for it or Trollden, this would be a card that they would sort of celebrate as far as competition goes. I'm not really sure what to say other than, I really, really hope we never see the day in whatever competitive scene comes where this card sees play, because I honestly think it's very much less skill intensive than a Mundustone or a Wabbajack, and I hope I've illustrated that well for you guys. That being said, I hope people, if it is just for the new players, I hope they do have fun with it. But in the future, I would hope that cards that they develop just for the new players for that sort of RNG-based purpose are pretty obviously unplayable. I'm fine with them being created. I just hope they're things that new players can experiment with, and then, after they have their fun, they learn that it's not competitive and they never impact high legend or tournament games. As it is, I'm not totally sure this ever will in the first place, but yeah, that's basically my thoughts on it. Hopefully it does not. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this card. Be sure to leave a comment below. Do you think it's too much RNG? Do you think it's fine? Do you think this game's current card pool had too much RNG already, or do you think it needed a little bit of boost? Do you think this is maybe even too much, if you thought the game needed more RNG in the first place? What do you think this goes in? I could see like Control Spellsword, Ram Scout, etc. as maybe a tech choice against other control decks. My initial thought is that it's much better than Orb of Vermina, so any deck that might want to play that, and in the metagame or meta call that you're making with Orb, you might just want to play this instead. Not totally sure, but yeah. And also has cool synergy with Raiding Party and stuff, so maybe if a control deck pops up using the token cards, you could transform those for easy uses on the Rebirth. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, leave a like on the video if you enjoyed the sort of analysis rant and, you know, basically rambling. That's not really a rant, but sort of rambling discussion about it. If you've enjoyed, leave a like. Stay tuned for future strategy content, more discussion, more news, more deck techs, more stream highlights, and stay tuned to the stream as well. I'll link it down below for Daily Legends streams. Feel free to drop a follow. Feel free to drop a subscription. I'd greatly appreciate the support. So yeah, I will see you guys next time.